Hello, Bravs. We return with Tried for Her Life. Oh, look at open right up to chapter 2. Oh, how quaint. Chapter 2, What Was Sought and What Was Found. They sought her that night, and they sought her next day. They sought her in vain till a week passed away. The highest, the lowest, the loneliest spot, her husband sought wildly, but found her not. The mistletoe bough. When the lion burners and his faithful servant returned to the haunted chapel after having comfortably disposed of the horses. Here, let me get something underneath this so it's not sagging. Let me start that over. When lion burners and his faithful servant returned to the haunted chapel after having comfortably disposed of their houses for the rest of the night, the interior was still so dark that they did not at first discover the absence of Sybil, especially as the covering lay heaped upon the mattress, so like a sleeping form, that even in a less murky darkness it might have been mistaken for her. As it was now very cold, Mr. Berners, who had found a tinder box and a coil of wax, tapers among his other effects in the wagon, struck a light with the intention of kindling a fire. Joe brought some broken sticks and dry brushwood from the far corner where lion burners had piled it up just before the flight from the chapel, and between the master and man they soon kindled a cheerful blaze that lighted up every nook and crevice of the old interior. Then Mr. Berners turned toward the mattress to see how his wife might be sleeping. "Why, she is not here! She has waked up and walked out," he exclaimed, in some surprise and annoyance, but not in the least alarm, for he naturally supposed that she had only left the chapel for a few minutes and would soon return. "Hi! Where the devil she took herself off to all alone this unlawful time of the night?" cried Joe in dismay. "Oh, not far. She will soon be back again," answered Mr. Berners cheerfully, and then he took one of the blankets from the mattress and folded it up for a seat, and sat down upon it near the fire and stretched his benumbed hands over the blaze. Joe followed his example, stretching out his hands also and staring across the fire at his master, staring at such a rate that Mr. Berners, feeling somewhat inconvenienced, sharply demanded, "What the deuce do you mean by that, Joe? I want to go and search for my mistress. I don't feel satisfied into my own mind about her." "Why, what are you afraid of, man?" "Ghostesses." "Absurd." "Well, now, no it ain't, master. I've knowed Miss Sybil longer than you have. I've knowed her ever since she was born, and I don't believe that she'd go out all alone by herself in the dead of night to the lonesome churchyard. That I don't. And I as afeard as the ghostesses have spared her away." "Preposterous, Joe. Have you lived in an intelligent family and in the Christian community all your life to believe in ghostesses, as you call them? Are you such a big fool as all that? At your time of life?" "Yes, master. It's just such a big fool as all that at my time of life, and I want to go out and search for my young mistress," said Joe in the spirit of dogged persistence, as he began to gather himself up. "Stop. Stay where you are. If one of us must go, it must be myself," said Mr. Berners. "Which would be a heap the most properest proceedings anyways," muttered Joe, sulkily setting himself in his seat again, in a manner that seemed to say, "And I wonder why you didn't do it before. She really ought to be back by this time, even if she went out but the moment before we returned, and she may have gone out before that," murmured Mr. Berners with some little vague uneasiness, as he arose and buttoned his overcoat and went into the churchyard. The day was dawning, and the old tombstones gleamed faintly from their bushes in the pale gray light of early morning. "She cannot have gone far. She would not venture. She must be very near," he said to himself, and he murmured softly, "Sybil, Sybil, where are you, love?" There was no answer, as he raised his voice a little. And this page has been detached, and the wind is blown in there, so I'll have to hold it. "Sybil, Sybil, Sybil, my darling." Still there was no response. His vague uneasiness became anxiety, and he called aloud, "Sybil, Sybil!" But nothing came of it, and his anxiety grew to terror, and he ran wildly about shouting her name till all the mountain rocks and glens echoed and re-echoed. What's up with the umlauts over re-echoed? Come on, focus. Anyway, it's not going to focus. Oh, we lost the page. Sybil. And now he was joined by Joe, whose faithful and affectionate heart was wrung with anxiety and distress for his beloved and missing young mistress. You can't find her? Oh, master, where is she gone? What have become of her? Oh, what shall we do? He cried, wringing his hands in great trouble. We must search for her, Joe. This is very strange and very alarming, said Mr. Berners, striking off into the path that led to the fountain and shouting her name at every step. But only the mountain echoes answered. In an agony of anxiety, they beat around the woods and thickets, and climbed the rocks and went down into the glens, still shouting, always shouting her name. Day broadened, the sun arose, and its first rays struck them as they stood upon the heights behind the chapel, looking all over the wilderness. In the name of heaven, now what are we to do? Exclaimed Lion Berners, speaking more to himself than to another. Joe was standing, leaning upon his stick in an attitude of the deepest despair, but suddenly he raised his head, and a gleam of light shot over his dark face as he said, I tell you what we can do, master. Where she's took to, we can find out at all events. I say when she's took to, for she never went out of her own accords. Heaven help my poor darling. No, she never did, but how do you think you can trace her, Joe? This-a-way, I'll take the freshest of them horses and ride home as fast as I can for life and death, and I'll snatch up her little dog as he has been pining away ever since she left, and I'll bring it here and make it smell to the bedclothes where she lay, and then put it on the scent to lead us the way she went. Eureka, Joe. The instinct of faithful affection in man or brute sometimes puts pure reason to the blush by its superior acumen. I mean, that's quite a sentence for a guy whose wife is not only on trial for murder, but who's now suddenly disappeared. I don't know no more in the dead what you're talking about, master, but that's the way to find out where Miss Sybil was took, answered practical Joe. Come then, we will go at once and look at the horses. I think, Joe, that one of your cart horses would be better to take, as they have not been so hard worked as ours, said Mr. Berners as they ran down the steep to the thicket in the rear of the chapel where they had left their horses. In a very few minutes Joe had selected and saddled his horse and stood ready to start. I needn't tell you to be prudent, Joe, and to drop no hint of your errand, said Mr. Berners. Well, no, you needn't take that there trouble, Marse Lion, 'cause you'd be a cautioning of Joe, as is caution enough already. Good morning, Marse Lion. I'll be at Blackhall afore the family is well out of bed. I'll be back here with the little dog afore you have time to get unpatient, said Joe, climbing into his saddle and riding away. Mr. Berners returned to the chapel, where he found the fire smoldering out, but everything else in the same condition in which he had left it when he went in pursuit of Sybil. Far too restless to keep still, he walked up and down the length of the chapel until he was fairly tired out. Then he went to the front door and sat down, keeping his eyes upon the entrance of the little thicket path by which he knew that Joe must return. And although he knew it was much too early to expect the messenger back, yet he still impatiently watched that path. Presently the sound of approaching horsemen struck upon his listening ear. They were coming up the path through the thicket, and presently they emerged from it, not two or three, but couple after couple, until the old churchyard was filled with sheriff's officers and militiamen. Sheriff Benthwick himself was at their head. In great surprise, as if they had come in quest of him, Mr. Berners went forward to receive the party. Lion Berners was known to have been the companion of his fugitive wife, and therefore a sort of an outlaw. Yet the sheriff took off his hat and accosted him respectfully. Mr. Berners, I am greatly surprised to see you here, he said. Not less than myself at seeing you, answered Lion. We are here to seek out a set of burglars whom we have reason to believe have their lair in this chapel, said Mr. Benthwick. Then your errand is not to me, observed Lion. Certainly not. Though, should I find Mrs. Berners here as well as yourself, as I think now highly probable, I shall have a most painful duty to perform. Ah, sir, within the last terrible month, I have become all too much accustomed to the sight of friends with painful duties to perform, as they delicately put it, but you will be spared the pain. Mrs. Berners is not here with me. Not here with you? Then where is she? Excuse me, Mr. Bentwick, said Mr. Berners gravely. You certainly forget yourself. You cannot possibly expect me to tell you, even if I knew myself, he added in an undertone. No, I cannot indeed, admitted the sheriff. Nor did I come here to look for Mrs. Berners, having had neither information nor suspicion that she was here. Nevertheless, if I find her, I shall be constrained to arrest her. Were it not for my duty, I could almost pray that I might not find her. I do not think you will, said Mr. Berners grimly. And meanwhile, the officers and the militiamen, at a sign from the sheriff, had surrounded the chapel so that it would be impossible for anyone who might be within its walls to escape from it. Now, Mr. Berners, as you assure me that your wife is not within this building, perhaps you may have no objection to enter it with me, said the sheriff. Not the least in the world, answered Lion Berners, leading the way into the chapel. As the sheriff dismounted from his horse, threw the bridle to an attendant, and followed. The interior was soon thoroughly searched, having nothing but its bare walls and vacant windows, with the exception of Sybil's forsaken bed near the altar, the smoldering fire in what had once been the middle aisle, and the little pile of brushwood in the corner. There is certainly no one here but yourself, Mr. Berners, yet here are signs of human habitation, said the sheriff, significantly. Lion Berners laughed painfully, and then he thought it would be safest to inform the sheriff of some part of the truth rather than to leave him to his own conjectures, which might cover the whole case. So he answered, I do not mind telling you, Mr. Bentwick, that myself and my injured wife took refuge in this place immediately after the terrible tragedy that so unjustly compromised her safety. We remained here several days and then departed. These things that you notice had been brought for our accommodation and were left here when we went away. So you were not at Pendleton's, not for an hour. That is strange. But how comes it that you are here now without your wife, Mr. Berners? Sir, I have told you all that I mean to tell, and now my lips are sealed on the subject of my wife, said Lion Berners firmly. I cannot and do not blame you in the least, said the sheriff kindly. All that we have to do now is to pursue our search for the burglars, and if in the course of it we should come upon Mrs. Berners, we must do our duty, he concluded. To that proposition Mr. Berners assented with a silent bow and bitterly compressed lips. The sheriff then went to the door of the vault, and stooping down with his hands upon his knees, peered through the iron grating more in curiosity than in any hope of finding a clue to the robbers. And in fact he discovered nothing but the head of that narrow staircase whose foot disappeared in the darkness below. Phew, what a damp, deadly air comes up from that foul pit. It hasn't been opened in half a century, I suppose, exclaimed Mr. Bentwick, taking hold of the rusty bars and trying to shake the grating. But finding it immovable, he ceased his efforts and turned away. Then he went to the chapel door and called his men around him, saying, There is no sign of the miscreants inside the ruin. We must search for them outside. And he divided his party into 4 detachments, and one he sent up the narrow path leading to the fountain, another he sent up to the heights, and another down into the glen, while he himself led the 4th back upon the path leading through the thicket. And they beat the woods in all directions without coming upon the trail of the burglars, but Sheriff Bentwick, in going through the thicket with his little party, met a harmless Negro on a tired horse with a little dog before him. The sheriff knew the Negro and accosted him by name. Joe, what are you doing here so far from your home? Joe was ready with his answer. If you please, master, I'm coming to fetch away some truck left here by a picnic party from our house. Ah, picnic party. I know all about that picnic party. I have been up to the old ruin and had a talk with your master, and he has told me of it, said the sheriff cunningly, hoping to betray the Negro into some admissions that might be of service to him in tracing Sybil. But his cunning was no match for Joe's. Well, master, he said, if Marse Lion told you all about that, you must be satisfied into your honorable mind, as I am a telling of the truth, and does come after the truck left in the chapel, which you may see my wagon a standing out there on the road. Beant for yourself. Then if you have a wagon, why do you come on horseback? Lord, master, I couldn't go no ways get a wagon through this here thicket. The sheriff felt that was true, and that he had been making a fool of himself. He made a great many more inquiries, but received no satisfaction from astute Joe. He asked no question about the little dog, considering her of no importance. And at length, having no pretext to stop the negro, he let him pass and go on. Joe, glad to be relieved, touched up his horse and trotted briskly through the thicket and through the graveyard to the ruined door of the old chapel. Here he dismounted, tied his horse to a tree, and put down the little Skye terrier, who no sooner found herself at liberty than she bounded into the church and ran with joyous leaps and barks, and jumped upon her master, licking or kissing, as she understood kissing, his hands and face all over with her little tongue, and assuring him how glad she was to see him. Nellie, Nellie, good Nellie, pretty Nellie, said Mr. Berners, caressing her soft, curly brown hair. But Nellie grew fidgety. Something was wanting. The best thing of all was wanting, her mistress. So she jumped from her master's lap, not forgetting to kiss him good-bye, a direct lick upon his lips, and then she ran snuffing and whining about the floor of the chapel until she came to the mattress and blankets, where she began wildly to root and paw about, whining piteously all the while. Nellie, good dog, said Mr. Berners, taking the blanket and holding it to her nose. Sybil, Sybil, seek her, seek her. The little Skye terrier looked up with a world of intelligence and devotion in her brown eyes, and recommenced her rooting and pawing and snuffing around the bedding, and for some little time was at fault. But at length, with a quick bark of delight, she struck a line of scent, and with her nose close to the floor, cautiously followed it to the door of the vault, at which she stopped and began to scratch and bark wildly, hysterically, running back to her master and whining, and then running forward to the door and barking and scratching with all their might and main. There she is, master. Mistress is down in that vault. So sure I'm a living beep. N-word, exclaimed Joe, who now came up to the door. Good heaven, she could not live there an hour. The very air is death, but if there was a breath of life remaining, she must hear and answer us, exclaimed Lion Berners in breathless haste, as he went to the door of the vault, and putting his lips close to the bars, called loudly, Sybil, Sybil, my darling, are you there? But though he bent his ear and listened, in the dead silence and dread suspense, no breath of answer came. And little Nellie, who had ceased her noise, began to whine again. Lion Burner soothed her into quietness and began to call again and again, but still no breath of response from the dark and silent depths below. If she is there, she is dead, groaned Lion Burners in a voice of agony, as he thought of all Sybil had told him of the open vault and the mysterious figures that had passed to and from it in the night, and which he had set down as so many dreams and nightmares reverted to his memory. Oh, if this chapel were indeed the den of thieves, if they had some secret means of opening that vault, if they had come upon his sleeping wife while she was left alone in the chapel, and robbed her of the money and jewels she had about her person, and then murdered her, and taken her body down into the vault for concealment, or if, as was most likely, for there was no mark of violence or stain of blood about the place, they had taken her to the vault first, and robbed and murdered her there. Oh, if these horrible fears should be realized. With the very thought, Lion Burners went pale and cold as marble, in an anguish such as he had never felt in the severest crisis of their sorely troubled lives. Joe, he cried, go search the wagon for the crowbar belonging to Captain Pendleton. It must be there somewhere, and I must break this vault door open, or break my heartstrings in the trial. Crowbar is all right, master, and I'll go out and fetch it as fast as I can, but we'll never see mistress alive again. Never, master, in this world, sobbed Joe, as he arose from his knees near the door and went upon his errand. Little Nellie renewed her passionate demonstrations of distress and anxiety, now furiously barking and scratching at the door, now jumping upon her I can't say it now. jumping upon her master's breast and looking up into his face and whining, as if telling him that her mistress was down there, imploring his human aid to free her and wondering why it was not given. I know it, my poor little dog, I know it all, said Lion soothingly, but little Nellie was incredulous and inconsolable and continued her hysterical deportment through the half hour which intervened between the departure and the return of Joe. Ah, give me the tool, eagerly exclaimed Mr. Burner, snatching the crowbar from the negro as soon as he saw him. And he went and applied it with all of his force to the door, straining the strong muscles until they knotted like cords, while Joe looked on in anxiety and suspense. And little Nellie stood approvingly, wagging her tail as if to say, now at last you are doing the right thing. But with all Lion straining and wrenching, he failed to move the impassable door one hair's breadth. Joe also took a turn at the crowbar, but with no more success. They rested a while and then united their efforts, and with all their strength essayed to force the door, but without the slightest effect upon its immovable bars. I might have known we could not do it this way, for neither Pendleton nor myself could succeed in doing so. Joe, we must take down the altar and take up the flagstones, but that will be a work of time and difficulty, and you will have to go back home and bring the proper tools. But the day is most gone, master, and it will take me most all night to go to Blackhall and get the tools and come back here. And is my poor mistress to stay down there into that dismal place all the time, sobbed the negro. Joe, if she is there, as the little dog insists that she is, you know that she must be dead. And it is her body that we are seeking, groaned Lion Burners in despair. I know it, master. I knows it all too well, but I can't feel as it is true all the same. And oh, even to leave her dead body there so long, said Joe, bursting into a storm of tears and sobs. That cannot be helped, my poor fellow. Besides, I shall sit at this door and watch till you return, and we can work down into the vault. She shall not be quite alone, Joe. So persuaded, Joe, unmindful of fatigue, once more set out for Blackhall. But on this occasion he took another horse, which was fresher. The sun had now set, and the short winter twilight was darkening into night. And that's going to be the end of this chapter, bravs. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye, Baba.